Hello, I'm Noreen Tomasi, and I'm the director of the Center for Fiction. Some of you may know us from our home on East 47th Street in Midtown Manhattan. We're now in Swing Space, and we've been very lucky to create this partnership with WNYC in the Jerome L. Greene space here in order to continue to do events while we wait for our building in Brooklyn across from the Brooklyn Academy of Music to be completed. We'll open there on December 10th, and we hope those of you who are interested in fiction and literature, and fiction in all its manifestations on small screens and large, will come to visit us at the Center for Fiction in Brooklyn, 15 Lafayette Avenue. We began this series, the idea for this series, as a result of our unhappiness, our increasing unhappiness with the environment in America post-election, and our feeling that America wasn't the America we knew, and that it was not certainly the America we experienced here as New Yorkers, and that we experienced in dealing with writers across the country and creative people across the country. And so we wanted to do something which brought different voices to an audience with the idea that these voices are America, hence the title of the series, I Am America. This week has been an especially trying week, hasn't it? The news has been absolutely awful. We were just talking backstage about the fact that we just heard that Trump has saved us from himself, that he imposed this horrible policy of separating children from their parents at the border and creating these warehouses for toddlers and infants and small children. And now he has decided to end that policy, which I suppose is a good thing. But in fact, it doesn't solve the problem, does it? All those children have already been separated from their parents. And so whether they can be reunited, what will happen to them, what will happen to us in America as we become more and more accustomed to the new horrors that we face every day is an open question. And so I think it's especially important in a time like this to hear from the voices of writers and other creative people, because I think that they can be our guides and our helpers. So we at the Center for Fiction are really very much devoted to that, to bringing these voices to the table however we can, and to support these kinds of conversations whenever we can. And you should know as well that at the Center for Fiction, one of the things we do is not only to support conversations, but to support writers from the very earliest point in their career with money and support and resources and time to work and space to work, to ensure that a real diversity of voices is heard in America and is present in our literature in America. So that's very important to us. Tonight we have two amazing writers with us. And the topic tonight is the weight of history, which we're all feeling, but there are particular histories that are foundational, in a sense, histories for America that we can't really escape. We've been trying, I think, in some ways to escape them for many, many years, but there are histories that are violent and coercive and bloody, and so they are very much a part of what America is as well. And so we want to talk about how those histories resonate for us today, and we wanted to do that with a novelist and with a memoirist. So let me introduce our writers. Terese Marie Mailhot is from Seabird Island Band. She graduated with an MFA from the Institute of American Indian Arts, and her writing appears in West Branch, Guernica, Pacific Standard, Elle, the LA Times, Long Reads, Medium, and elsewhere. She serves as a faculty member at the Institute of American Indian Arts, and she is a Tecumseh postdoctoral fellow at Purdue University. She is the author of the New York Times best-selling Heartberries, a memoir, published this year to great acclaim. It's the powerful, poetic story of a woman's coming of age on the Seabird Island Indian Reservation in the Pacific Northwest. Having survived a profoundly dysfunctional upbringing to find herself hospitalized with both PTSD and bipolar II disorder, Mayo begins to write her way out of trauma, and the result is this, what I found to be absolutely searingly honest, heart-wrenching, and beautifully written memoir. Angela Flournoy is the author of The Turner House, which was a finalist for the National Book Award and a New York Times Notable Book of the Year. The novel was also a finalist for our Center for Fiction First Novel Prize, the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize for Debut Fiction, and an NAACP Image Award. She is a National Book Foundation 5 Under 35 honoree for 2015. She was the 2016-2017 Rona Jaffe Foundation Fellow at the New York Public Library's Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers, and she most recently taught at Princeton University. In this stirring debut novel, The Turner House, Flournoy explores the question of home and the value of that as a physical place rooted in a particular neighborhood in a rapidly changing city. She explores this through the lens of the Turner family of Detroit. Spanning nearly 3/4 of a century and several generations, the book becomes a portrait not only of the Turners, their lives, their ghosts, their histories as a family, but also of the city of Detroit and its evolution or devolution over decades. We're going to begin this evening with a reading from each of the writers. We'll then have a conversation on stage, and then we'll open to Q&A and discussion with the audience. So, Angela, do you mind if I ask you to begin reading?
Not at all. I'm going to read something I've never read before, or that I don't recall reading before. When Troy and his partner Higgins first arrived at the house, a 2-story brick bungalow near the corner of McNichols and Livernois, it had looked salvageable. Sure, the garage was up in flames, but since even halfway decent houses usually had a thick fire-resistant wall separating the garage from the living areas, he thought it would be a short ordeal over before noon. He watched the firefighters spray the roof with water and slate smoke columns lick the sky. He and Higgins helped keep onlookers at a safe distance. Higgins was better at this. He was shorter than Troy, but older at 49 and fatter. He used his belly like a flare, directing people away from the house and fire engine. Troy used a more apologetic approach. While Higgins said, "Stay back, I'm not going to tell you again," Troy offered, "Do me a favor and keep off this side of the street, okay?" When he'd first joined the police force, he realized he was just a little too light-skinned, too young-looking, too pretty, really, to pull off being the bad cop, especially next to Higgins. It just made people giggle. The mother and 2 little girls who lived in the house were fine, but a relative drove them to the hospital anyway, much to the disappointment of the EMT guys in the ambulance. They'd wanted something to show for having arrived on time. Troy had stood witness to at least 100 fires during his 2.5 years as an officer with the Detroit Police Department. Accidental fires like this one appeared to be fires in which the arsonist was caught, fires in which no arsonist was sought because the property had already been condemned and there weren't enough investigators to spare. He had never gone out on Devil's Night, the eve of Halloween, when mayhem and flames used to engulf certain parts of the city. Francis Turner was no great disciplinarian, but he prohibited anyone from leaving the Yarrow house on October 30th. He'd sit in the armchair facing the door with a seldom-used hunting rifle across his lap and a protective scowl on his face that remained even after he dozed off. Troy might have found ways to sneak out if he really wanted to, but the sight of Francis putting forth so much effort made him feel loved. The wind suddenly picked up and the fire spread. All of the house's windows seemed to blow at once. There had only been 1 truck on the scene, 8 firefighters in total. In less than 20 minutes, the house was gone. No sooner had the last hose been shut off than a big black pickup truck, an F-150 with Denning & Son General Contractors lettered in yellow on the side, came speeding up the street. a skinny old man driving, with the younger skinny guy, the son, Troy presumed, riding shotgun. They wanted to talk to the owners about rebuilding, give them an estimate. They'd heard about the fire on their police scanner. Troy told him to get lost. Higgins seconded. All we want to do is leave a car with someone, the older one said. Troy couldn't tell if it was the sun or some kind of texturizer that was making the man's hair tint orange. Or give us a phone number. They're going to need somebody to help him rebuild. Someone from the small crowd of onlookers lobbed an empty Verner's bottle at the truck. It was plastic and bounced off the rear bumper, but Denning and Son wanted Troy and Higgins to arrest the thrower. Higgins laughed until he nearly choked, his whole body jiggling under his bulletproof vest. The contractors drove off. The rest of the shift went by slowly. He and Higgins wrote fix-it tickets for broken headlights and too dark window tint. At lunch, Troy showed Higgins a grainy video on his phone of Camille's dance recital in Kaiserslautern, a gaggle of 9-year-old girls pirouetting to a song that sounded both Russian and Disney. Higgins played one of the newest beats that his 21-year-old son had produced. It was very J. Dilla-esque, Troy thought, with mellow drums and looped snatches of soulful vocals in the background. You heard about these furloughs, right? Higgins said, his mouth full of gyro. They're trying to get city workers to take 1 day off a month now for free, maybe more. Troy had not heard. They better not pull that shit at the department, all's I know. Higgins dabbed yogurt sauce from his mouth with a napkin. But if they do, I'll give you a heads up as soon as I hear. Give you some time to save up. I doubt they do that, Troy said. It's about to get hot. They know folks start killing each other when it gets too hot outside. Higgins nodded. True, they probably won't change nothing before summer's over. Maybe no more overtime, though. I know one thing, we gotta stop voting these crooked niggas into office, for the sake of our own paychecks at this point. Troy couldn't debate the crookedness of their current mayor, but it bothered him when people, particularly black people, bought into the notion that black politicians were really the ones who'd run the city into the ground. He knew enough history to understand that things had begun to go bad way before that. David Gardenhire and he often talked about resources, both the personal and the public, and how the problem with Detroit was that it had experienced a resource vacuum during white flight. Hundreds of thousands of black people who were never really welcome there, a lot with no access to higher education, were essentially left to run the city. They did a decent job in the beginning, back in the early days of Coleman Young, the first black mayor, but the surrounding suburbs hadn't wanted to do business with them. They essentially boycotted the newer, blacker Detroit, which would devastate any city's economy. During that same time, the automakers made poor decisions, yes, which made things worse, but it was the removal of money, the resources, he and David agreed, that had put things on a downward trend. Troy knew Higgins would argue with him to death over this. Higgins would list off every corrupt mayor, councilperson, and committee chair since the 80s at least. Troy had heard him go through his who's who of city crooks before, so Troy ate his gyro and asked to hear Higgins' sons beat again. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Therese?
Nobody wants to know why Indian women leave or where they go. Our bodies walk across the highway from the dances of our youth into missing narratives without strobe lights or sweet drinks in our small purses, or the talk of leaving. The truth of our leaving or coming into the world is never told. Will my ancestors' bones lay proud and dull in the grave or on display? Mine were a hot light, ready to go. Larry was my mother's boyfriend. He came into my life when I was 16. He started to walk across the halls naked. I thought he was a walking corpse. He played a ghost, looming between my mother and me. He went to the kitchen and never ate. His insides were rot. Drunks can't eat after a point. He drove me to school holding a beer can, a tangible thing in his unstable hand. My mother didn't believe me, so it was always an unreal taking. He touched me to help me out of the car. I searched for irrefutable things to tell my mother. None of it compared to the days they went clamming together or collected Devil's Club in the valley. My mother never liked the beach until Larry came around with his rake and gloves. They waded in gloomy water as I watched from the truck. They seemed content. It didn't matter if he groped me. It didn't matter if he groped my cousin. None of that mattered. I told my mother that she might have stopped drinking before I was born, but she was still a drunk. She stopped bringing Larry home. Instead, they went to his place in the city. There were only so many places where men like him could live. I took a bus there to find her. I saw my mother differently. Larry lived on the first floor in what I thought was a drug house. Women like me, girls like me, sat outside on couches with babies, stood inside the hallway, and made tea in the kitchen. I knocked on his bedroom door. My mother rummaged, ashamed, under the covers in his bed. In her purse, she rummaged through her purse and handed him $20. Here, he said, go back to the res. This is how we go missing. This is how we decide to leave. I left on Valentine's Day after the dance. The hall wasn't decorated. The girls and I stood in circles in strobe lights and had sweet drinks in all our small purses, and we had my talk of leaving. Fuck it, Lucy said, don't come back. Lucy was shorter than all the Chehalis girls, but she walked up to them anyway to start shit. We left drunk and went out along the highway. The trunks honked at our silhouettes. Nobody wants to know how we leave. I only had one bag to pack, and I didn't have money. My boyfriend Vito let me live with him in his mother's home. It was better than foster care. His whole family was large and Republican. I acclimated from my Marxist-Leninist mother to their lifestyle. We ate top sirloin and fried shrimp, and Bush became the president again. They asked me to vote and drove me to the polling station, and I went in and stood there long enough. Every day was like that for me. I called my mother to show her I could leave. What are you going to do? She asked. Not be there, I said. Where are you? She asked. When a man's hands become a ghost, there is no way to strip them from a body, haunting what a mother does not see. Native women walk alone from the dances of our youth into homes they don't know for the chance to be away. Their silhouettes walk across highways and into cars at night. They are troubled by nothing but the chance that they might have to come back someday to bury their mothers. My mother died on Thanksgiving. My brother was watching the Texas Chainsaw Massacre in the next room. Larry was already dead from liver failure. I flew in from a place far removed. I worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. I prayed over her body and touched her delicate skin. A bloat protruded from her neck, and I felt that too. I felt the deficit. I took her house and its contents and let her ghost in. The people said to put away the pictures, but I didn't. They said to cover the mirrors, but I didn't. The ritual of death was not interesting. And then I left her home again. I found humor in leaving. I punctured a friend's chest with a fork. He heard me when I said no. Another dug his knuckles into me. I didn't cover the marks. He gave me his credit card, and I bought diamonds and hammered silver. Another I left in the waiting room of his lawyer's office. Another I left in Miami. He didn't think I was like that, but I was clearly like that. I only smiled at the room service. What do you want? I asked men like an indictment. Another has white guilt and thinks his progress to bind me. Can you say all you want from me in one breath? Barbara asks what I get in leaving. I tell her that my husband left me in a hospital once before we were married. I guess I took him back to leave him. He visited me in the hospital for finality. Suicidal ideation troubled him too much. I asked if he felt culpable. There was a crafted tree on the walls for the sick women made of paper and crayon and glue. The tree had leaves, 30 different colors, with words on them like intelligent, smart, brave, bold, strong. Casey pointed to sexy. I put the leaf in my pocket and used it as a bookmark for a year. Barbara tells me to go back. He doesn't hit me, she says. He's intelligent. We have a baby. The wet street grass she braided is dry and straight. She puts it below the windshield in my car, and when I drive back, I'm not sure I will stay. Her house is a lot of old pictures and plants and draped scarves. A blue budgie sings in her office, and there are a few old drums around. It is everything of my mother and home. I hold my sons at night, and they are so still like rocks. I run my fingers over their foreheads and wonder how they don't collect dust. Boys asleep, and I am a rare carcass in the river, bloated with deficit. Every time I see wings flap, I think of leaving. It used to feel like breaking vertigo, and now it is just breaking. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Those were both amazing readings. Thank you both so much. I think it might be appropriate to start with this notion of ghosts, because both of you talk about ghosts in very different ways in your book. And we've heard a little bit from you, but I wondered if, Angela, you could start, because I don't know if our audience knows about how you use that idea of ghost in your novel. Yeah.
So there's a lot of characters in my novel, and one of them, the oldest of the Turner children, Troy, the person I just read about, is the 12th. But the firstborn believes that he has been sort of haunted by a haint, is what he calls it, which is kind of like in his family's tradition, like a southern ghost. And the ghost shows up when he's young and then doesn't show up for a while and then shows up again when he's older. And he begins to believe perhaps the ghost has always been there. And it becomes this sort of impetus to reconsider the way that he's lived his life and his own relationship to the past, and which includes like his father's relationship to perhaps his ghost also. Mm-hmm. And the idea to have the haint in the book was always sort of central to the conception of the book. So when I began writing the book, I only knew that I wanted to write about a very big family in Detroit, and I knew that I also wanted to write about a family that had like this history with this ghost. And one of the reasons why was because I had heard stories about haints growing up, but these stories were always from older people in my family, like grandparents and like great uncles and aunts. And these people all were part of the Great Migration. They'd been living in the North for like 50, 60 years. So they would tell these ghost stories, but they were always set in the South. It was as if these sort of like magical beings or supernatural beings couldn't travel, or like the belief was sort of tethered to a specific place, which I found really interesting and kind of indicative of like what happens when a person migrates, just how even what you believe can kind of change depending on where you find yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Therese, that reminds me, there's a really interesting thing that you said sometime talking about your mother as a healer and your mother, that basis of that spiritual community, and how she helped you to see place as inhabited in a certain way, not haunted, but enlivened by spirits, and also space, physical space, as familial and as sacred. And so I thought that just resonated for me in your saying that it felt as if the haints couldn't travel, that they were of a place. I don't know what you think about that, Terese, and could you talk a little bit about those ideas for you in the memoir and for you growing up? Yeah,
I mean, in our community, the way that we pray is like we literally make tobacco offerings to the land first. So like we say thank you for the land, and when you pray, you're praying to your family, and your ancestors are with you at all times, and that's kind of our belief system. So you're supposed to wake with the day, and you're supposed to be connected to the river and go there for power. So like that's just how I grew up, is like feeling familiar with the land. And when my mother passed away, I felt that slip, and which brought about the essay Indian Sick that's in the book, where it's about literally being haunted. What Indian Sick is when you do things like I did, which is like not cover the mirrors and let the ghosts in and let them loom. You end up sick, and in my culture, you're supposed to remedy that through ceremony. You're supposed to make peace with it. But in a white institution, you can't say, like, I need to make peace with my ancestors and I need to speak to my grandmother, like, in prayer, like they would commit you further, So I really had to work with both sides, kind of silently praying and thinking about my past and what I let in and how to remedy that through ceremony after I was in those white buildings,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And the ghosts in both your books are ominous. They're not friendly. The image of him as a ghost between you and your mother, and the ghost with Cha-Cha in your book it's ominous, no?
Well, without spoiling, it is sometimes ominous and sometimes not. And it's interesting you bring up this the point about, like, who can you talk about your beliefs in front of?
Yeah.
And that's something that I wanted to explore in my book. There's a lot of people in my family who believe in things that are not necessarily part of their, like, larger sort of Christian faith. They're things that they have sort of carried with them really since, like, slavery. And so they're things that they don't think they're appropriate to kind of, like, talk about in certain settings. And that is, like, one of the reasons why I wanted to have a person like the main character, Cha-Cha, who finds himself to be sort of very, like, a northern pragmatist kind of person. He has his, like, sort of older Black Southern belief that, like, it lingers with him and sort of has, like, a physical manifestation for him. And throughout the course of the book, sometimes it does seem like the thing is out to get him, right? So when he's young, he thinks that, like, the thing is there to, like, yank him out of this coveted sort of single room he's got in this house with all of his siblings. But when he gets older, that's perhaps not the case. And that was one of the ways that I tried to explore, like, what beliefs we try to, like, hide and what is considered, like, not appropriate. And what's funny is I've toured a lot with the book, and the further I go south, the more people, not just Black people, like, are like, yeah, I know what a hane is, and I know what it can and cannot do, and I know how to keep it away. But so it really just depends on the context. So some of the things that I grew up thinking were, like, too Black and let's not talk about him, are not necessarily even too Black. They're just too not of the place that we find ourselves in. Mm-hmm. But we were the only people around with this sort of belief, and so we assumed it had to do with our sort of general, the thing that made us different in all these other contexts, when really it could be just that we weren't in the South anymore. And that is something that was really eye-opening for me, the way that your, like, very ideas and your sort of, like, your folklore and whatever you want to call it, sort of your religion, can be kind of just squashed all into superstition and something you don't talk about in public, depending on where you find yourself.
Mm-hmm. And Therese, what are your thoughts about that? And that notion of, specifically the notion of he's a predator, right? Mm-hmm. And the image you use for him is a ghost.
Yeah, really, because you can't, nobody believes you when you've seen it, right? And you're the only one bearing witness to your own haunting, right? Mm-hmm. And it stays with you like a ghost, which I think could only be articulated with that, Yeah.
Something you said struck me about Detroit and made me think of the manipulation of physical space by white power structures, because I mean, obviously the history of seizure of lands and the moving of native peoples onto reservations is one kind of limiting and confining and devaluing of people. But there was another thing that happened after the Northern Migration, which was a kind of manipulation of urban space to limit, to devalue, to undermine, and to control as well. And so there's an analogous thing that happened there in some ways, I think, that is about occupying physical space and owning land and connection to space and land, and then the connection to that space and land being disrupted and somehow disvalued. No?
Yeah, I mean, my aunt, Lee Miracle, she's an author. She was the first one to tell me that there's a direct correlation between the ravaging of land and the ravaging of Indigenous women, and that we're usually the first ones to be exploited. And I think the thing is it's difficult to talk about. I mean, I'm here under a treaty. We were here before borders, right? So I'm here under the Jay Treaty. I was originally born in Canada, but because the U.S. and Canadian border separated nations, they had to make a treaty that allowed us to pass freely through the border. So for us, land is we are blocked away from our original places of prayer. We had to cultivate new spaces. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, one thing that I tried to kind of explore in this book is the ways that sort of African American people in this country have continuously tried to get a toehold into like a concept and an idea that was never for them, and that on its surface is built on a lie, right? And all of the ways that it keeps kind of becoming a new sort of like, there's a new trapdoor, and there's a new trapdoor, and there's a new trapdoor, and that is very much tied to this sort of like original, like it's built on a lie. Mm-hmm. And it's one of the things that I endeavored in the book to, some of the characters in the book, they have sort of this intense shame about, so their house in Detroit is now worth like 1/10 of what their mortgage is, and they have this intense shame that they've sort of failed in the American dream. And one of the things that I tried to do by the end of the book is provide some other ways for them to think about this besides we are failures, right? And one of them is that this is not a system that you were ever supposed to be anything else than a failure, which doesn't mean that like one shouldn't try to have a good life and provide for their family. But the idea that if you cannot sort of maintain ownership of this thing, that means that you have kind of failed on this like grand experiment of your life. There's just so many other factors at play. And it's one of the things that can seem really discouraging to kind of boil it down that way, to say, well, don't worry about owning a home because this country is a lie. But in another way, it's just, to me, I find it to be kind of really sobering to think about what are the things you're really putting your sort of self-worth and your identity into. And so the main character of this book, Cha-Cha, his self-worth and his identity is very much tied into like home ownership and sort of being stable and being kind of like the cornerstone of his family. And when those things become in jeopardy, he really doesn't know who he is. And so he has to figure out other ways to have like a system of self-worth mm-hmm. that is not attached to anyone else but himself. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, it's very helpful. I also wanted to talk a little bit, I think we touched on this a little bit backstage, but there's another kind of oppression and another kind of shame going on in your memoir, not that the character themselves has shame, but it is the constructs and the ideas connected to mental illness and to navigating that reality and navigating those systems and lack of care and that concern in this country as it is now. And I wondered if you could speak a little to that, because it's sort of, not only are you Native American and a woman, but you've dealt also with mental illness in a society that's pretty harsh about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think from, just to go off what Angela was saying, like, one thing I've noticed is, like, setting your own narrative is really important, giving you something to hope for. And I feel like for Indigenous people right now, with the border and the apprehension of children, we're really familiar with that because of Indian boarding school and residential school, which apprehended our children and put them in school until they were 18. My mother went there, my grandmother went there. But people are often talking about that when they are posting about what's going on to the kids now. They're talking about Indigenous people and how we've been treated. But one thing they don't talk about is how we were radical and fought back. Mm-hmm. And I would like that to be integrated into the narrative, because I feel like we've been relics who have just existed in fixed plight for a long time.
Yes.
And I feel like my mental illness has a lot to do with being Indigenous, because, growing up on a reservation where you're poor, and it was infested with ladybugs and mold, and there's something that would make any child insane living there and being neglected for several years. So, for me, a lot of the circumstances we were experiencing made me feel crazy. And changing the narrative was really important, which the last few essays are me trying to become autonomous, not even away from that plight, but have the narrative evolve, Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. But those circumstances so much exist for children today, and we're aware of it because of the latest thing at the border, but
it's traumatic trauma.
But they exist every day all over America for children separated from parents and thrown into the foster system, either because of draconian laws that are incarcerating people unjustly, or migrant workers, raids, and their children being lost. So that's something that really is continuing to happen.
Yeah. And I feel like, I'm still where I'm from, and my friends and family are still existing not even in those conditions, but if we're not in those conditions, our other family members are existing in those conditions, like where I come from. And children are apprehended at an alarming rate in Indigenous communities because we experience tremendous disparity. So if you're poor, you're not a good mom, Mm-hmm. So that separation is something I'm really familiar with too. I mean, trauma really does shape your life, and I feel like the only way I could exist was to create something really beautiful out of it, and really own that mental illness is real. And I feel like in Indigenous communities, they are reluctant to say you have a problem, because it means you're going to have a harder time getting a job, and you're going to have a harder time being accepted as a normal person,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But also probably because the mental health care system in this country is more focused on the worried well with means for treatment, and not so much reaching into communities where there is poverty, where there are issues, where there is mental illness, and that it's really affecting those communities, but they're not the resources to really help those people, and so that they just get sort of warehoused through because our system doesn't focus on that. It focuses on something else.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's a real challenge. I wonder if you have questions for each other as well about the books. I know you've read each other's books and you know one another. And for me, I wanted to, while you think of that, I wanted to say that one of the things that is so striking about both books is the fact that the women in the books are so challenged and yet so strong in both books, and are kind of, in your novel, the women are pretty amazing, and I think, despite her gambling addiction, etc., she's a kind of an anchor in a certain reality for the book and for the family and for, and so that kind of, and we don't want to pose that on women either. You have to be the anchor in the midst of surrounding chaos, but it is a factor in both books, and maybe you could both speak to that a little bit.
Well, in my book, I purposefully made Layla, I think like the main female character, not very strong, or I tried to. I mean, what we consider strength, I don't know, it kind of varies, right? So I tried to make her not kind of like me. So there were conscious moments where I was like, well, this is what I would do, and this is not what she's going to do. Because we sort of live in a moment of like #Black Girl Magic, which I find to be sometimes awesome, and sometimes it can be really kind of stifling, like this idea that we are somehow impervious to the natural things that might put someone in a less than magical and like resilient place in their life.
Yeah.
I think that's an easy way. It's not far from there to thinking that we don't need the sort of assistance or care or sensitivity that anyone else needs. But I think probably, Noreen, part of the reason, not to get too crafty, but one of the things you can do in fiction is figure out other ways to trick readers into thinking that a character is perhaps like capable of things that they are not actually doing in the book. And in my case, so Layla, even though she's a mess, and she's not very sort of like actively strong, structurally, she does provide an anchor in the book when she shows up. She keeps time for the book.
Yes.
So that's one way that she feels like she's kind of grounded, even though she doesn't know she's got like literally 2 pennies to run together, and she's running from everyone in her life, and she's largely deluding herself for most of the book.
Yeah.
But because on the page, when she shows up, it's like, oh, okay, well, it's Thursday. You feel like you're grounded, like she's grounding more than she is. And that was that's actually the question that I had for you, is in your memoir, like more than once, there's this discussion of like difficult women, and there's this really like sort of what I found to be really, I don't know what's the right adjective, really just like appealing like ownership of it. Like, I'm just a difficult person, and that doesn't mean that I'm not sort of worthy of everything that I think that I'm worthy of. And there are times when men particularly seem to like push back against that. But it is one of the refrains of the book is this idea of like the value of sort of being difficult. So I don't know if you could say anything about that.
I feel like, it was like namely the men I was dating who like desired simplicity and niceness, which like, I think maybe I had been driven to men who desired something I could never be because I wanted to aspire to something impossible. But I'd always been too much. But I'd always considered that a plus. I thought somebody was going to luck out. And it proved true because, like, my husband never thought he would be married to a New York Times bestseller. And
there you go.
That's my too muchness because I was really relentless about finishing the book. I was really relentless about, on a line level, doing something tight. And the paperback's going to be even tighter. I have a question for your book.
Sure.
I'm like really envious of how cinematic it is, like how the scenes are set up and even how someone might lose their job or have an affair. Like, it's extremely detailed, and I wondered what research went into talking about some of the historical elements of your book.
So the historical elements of the book really were me trying to kind of cover my own. We both already cursed, but we were reading. It feels different now.
I didn't know if
reading.
we were supposed to or not.
I don't know if you are either. But anyway, like trying to cover my own tale, I guess, because I'm not from Detroit. My father's from Detroit. I have a lot of family in Detroit. I went there throughout my life, but I'm from LA. And so the research was really a way for me to feel just sort of like cloaked in information as I tried to set the book there, which it was always the plan to set the book there. And so I was lucky. I was in graduate school. I was at Iowa at the time, so I had like access to a university library. And when you're like affiliated with a university, you can get any book, right? They can track down any book from you for you from anywhere. And so the first 2 years it took me 4 years to write the book, but the first 2 years was mostly research and like very little like writing, and then the second 2 years was a lot more writing. But I'm very self-conscious about being boring, and so probably some of the things you talk about, like the cinematic aspect, is how I like convinced myself that also having, maybe it's like a 4,000 word chapter and like 2,000 words is like history that I'm tucking in, but it's like in this like there's a house on fire.
It doesn't feel thrown in. It feels integrated, and that's a cinematic element. It feels natural, like you're really there, and really watching,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
I think we have some time to take questions from the audience. If someone's brave enough to go first, we can have a little discussion. Anyone have questions? Anyone like to speak to the theme of the evening, the weight of history, and ask questions about that?
So
Yeah.
I'll give this a shot.
Okay.
So I'm thinking about this aspect of storytelling, and I guess I have a couple questions. Therese, did you feel that at any time in your life or in the craft of writing your story, that at times you might have been the ghost that was kind of writing yourself into existence? And also, how did you handle telling your own story, but also telling other people's stories at the same time?
Yeah, my book begins with the line, "My story was maltreated," because I had been an observer of my life. I believed I was a product of my circumstance because I had been a foster kid and a neglected kid, and the casework labels you and then you act according. If you're a youth at risk, you are on 24-hour watch and you act up and they write it down and they label you difficult. And then when you're a young mother and a welfare mom, you're on the other side of a desk trying to convince somebody to give you something, and you become kind of like your story is always maltreated. Somebody is always treating you like a label. And I wanted to write myself, so I began the book with that assertion. I think it's really helped critics talk about my work, because I refuse to be labeled and reduced. And I assert that really from the start. And about writing about, so I was writing myself into the world, and I was telling them how to read me, which I really like that I wrote that book. But my family, I had to get my brothers on board because a lot of things I couldn't remember. I couldn't remember how my father really left. I was told to wait out on the porch, so I had no idea what was going on inside the house. So they filled in the blanks, and they also okayed themselves in the book. And, Casey and I had exchanged so many love letters and had so many, correspondence about what was going on. So I used that, but I had to get Casey on board with the fact that I wouldn't be painting him in a wholly positive light, but I also would be accountable to the fact that I did things that I thought were unforgivable when I was at my worst and untreated. So it was really tedious to get everyone to agree to let me write about them. And I did it really well. This writer, Tony Jensen, told me, you just give them a compliment, like say, they were beautiful, and then they'll be okay with you writing all the rest of them. So with Casey, I just talked about his largeness, and he really likes that because he used to play college football. So yeah.
It's funny. Question? Linda, you had a question? There's a microphone.
If I can phrase this well. Now knowing that it was your father who's actually from Detroit, but so perhaps your father and family, and then for you both being, both families coming from circumscribed communities, and both of you having written these remarkable books and being quite remarkable people, I think. I wonder what positive attributes you feel you have from your heritage, especially based on the fact that in your father's case and in your case, you've had your people together under these difficult circumstances, and there's been this positive resistance. But I also just wonder about any kind of positive inherited traits that you feel you have that are special.
Oh, that's an easy one for me. So my dad is the fifth of 13, and there are so many positive traits. I recently got married, and there were only two of his siblings there, two of his uncles, but they were the life of the party at our wedding, because they, I think that there's a lot of, you just develop certain kinds of communication skills. I think both sort of growing up where they grew up in Detroit, in very segregated Detroit in the 50s through 70s, they have very sort of strong senses of self, and they feel like survivors in a good way, not in a remorseful way, and they're very sort of proud of their own traditions. Absolutely, their musical traditions. They grew up during the height of Motown, and they think they're sort of experts on that kind of thing. But as far as being able, which is again goes back to this idea of being boring, never being boring, is how to tell a good story, and how to sort of when you have a moment where you have the floor, taking advantage of it and making it worth people listening to you is something that I learned very early from my family, and I think that is something that is very particular to where they grew up and what kind of cultural capital was important to them.
My mom was a poet first, and then that's how she spoke to me, and I was very explicit, and that's why we didn't get along. But now that she's gone, I feel like I've inherited her poetry, because I'm always trying to remember her voice. And and your mother speaks to you, right? You hear your mother's voice, and I think I've inherited that because I carry it with me so close. Yeah.
There's something you said in another interview that made me think of that. You said each generation exerts an influence on the ones to follow, even when that influence isn't consciously felt.
I don't remember saying that.
Well, it was really a great thing to say.
All right.
Yeah, I think that's partially true for all of us. In neuroscience lately, there's they've discovered that, or they feel they've discovered that our DNA actually carries certainly histories of trauma over generations, embedded in your DNA and somehow carried on, and conversely also embedded in the DNA are, whatever is celebratory in the culture as well. It's an interesting idea. Yeah.
I'm curious to know, how have your respective families reacted to your books? And Angela, even though it's not necessarily nonfiction, the Detroit community or family, if they've seen themselves in your characters, etc.
I should have said more people were beautiful. I never had that piece of advice. But it's been really, really positive. I've done more events in Detroit than I can count. And since my book came out, and one of the things that I think was very important to my family was that sort of broadly, they just didn't want a book that embarrass Black people. But once you get nominated for an Image Award, like, they don't even have to read the book. They're just like, you didn't do that because you wouldn't have been nominated for an Image Award. So, so that helps. But one of the thing that fiction does is that you can accidentally get at so many truths about people that you didn't even know and you weren't even thinking about them. And so it is sort of funny the ways that various people in my life had like pointed out things that they're like, this is about so-and-so. And I'm like, I had no idea that happened to so-and-so. But especially if you just have so many characters, there's just kind of statistically speaking, someone you didn't even know was dealing with something will see themselves in a character. And that's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my brothers were supportive from the start, and on a line level, they had read like all of it, so it was mostly positive, but the rest of my family was really indifferent because they didn't read, so they didn't care what I was doing. It was only when I was on The Daily Show that they actually set up like an honoring ceremony and realized that I was doing something. Mm-hmm. So, and I think it's overall positive. I feel like, it's different because nobody in my family was ever a published author. So it's like my children are inheriting a legacy, and then I'm starting something new. And my community members know now that there's like relevance to their individual like singular stories. Because if you're the first one to do it where you're from, you're opening the door,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Other questions? Something you just said really resonates for me, the notion of individual singular stories. Both of these books have so much to do with the weight of history, but are in such a large degree these individual singular stories. And I think that is what makes them so resonant for so many people and what makes them so effective in kind of carrying the weight of history so well. So thank you both very, very much. Please join me in thanking these two really wonderful writers. Thank you. Books for sale and that both writers will sign the books. I urge you to buy the books. That's the best possible thing you could do tonight. It's really important to support writers through buying their books. Thank you.